This podcast is intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
So it turns out it's not easy to find a safe house, especially if you're shopping in August. A house that might look well obscured from the street by trees in the summer might be in plain sight by winter when the leaves are gone. What are the neighbors like? Nosy and tight-knit, or are they chill? And the house needs multiple means of exit in case guards need to get the hell out of there in a situation where the main driveway is blocked. So, okay, there are a lot of boxes that need to get ticked, but you know what else is hard? Once you find a safe house, shopping to fill it in a hurry. After weeks of looking, the CIA finally found a good option for Vitaly Yurchenko, hours away from D.C., in the quiet countryside near Fredericksburg, Virginia, in a housing community called Coventry. A middle-aged woman named Catherine Shannon, that was not her real name, was the CIA logistics officer assigned to the move. Dave Richardson, who's now the general manager of Powell's Furniture, had only just begun his job as a sales clerk there in August of 1985.
It was a slow day, so not a lot of foot traffic in. But that particular day, it was my turn to watch the door. And of course, sometimes you fall asleep or whatever, watch some TV. We had all that going on, being a family-owned store. But I remember the day, a young lady, not a young lady, forgive me, but a middle-aged lady came in. I approached her.
He waited the required 45 seconds so that a customer didn't feel pounced on.
She introduced herself as an attorney. She said it was for a weekend retreat for attorneys that she worked for a law firm. And I believe his firm was Schaefer. She had given me a business card. That's what it was introduced as, a place for a retreat for burnout attorneys.
You know, just your regular old burnt out attorneys retreat. Only these lawyers must have been very suddenly burnt out because this retreat was urgent.
This thing needed to be done yesterday, is her words. Of course, that excited me as a new salesperson because I assumed it was going to be a large deal.
It turns out Catherine was shopping for several rooms and said she'd return with one of the attorneys in a couple of days to pick it out. Vitaly Yurchenko, the Soviet defector, was going furniture shopping.
Actually, they came back with him and two other gentlemen. And these two other gentlemen, I learned later, were with the department, the CIA. They were watching him. They were with him. They were his security. They were his blanket. And she was probably that blanket too. But again, I didn't know that. I didn't want to surmise that. I was still into the game of the sale, which was important at that time because I had no money. A little bit, but nothing to brag on.
Dave Richardson was right. Those two men were Yurchenko's CIA bodyguards. And as it happens, one of them was Dan Payne.
I remember going to this furniture store, and I remember that the only person in the furniture store was this young guy. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is going to be a big bill, and I hope he's working on commission.
From Waveland, I'm Julie Cohn, and this is The Redefector. This is Chapter 4, The Safe House. By the time Yurchenko and his entourage moved into the new safe house at Coventry, it was early September 1985, about a month after he first arrived. By then, some of the initial glow of his defection had worn off, and the relationship dynamics between the CIA, FBI, and the defector had begun to crystallize. I think it's important to get a clear view of what Yurchenko's day-to-day looked like while he was here in the US, and what those relationships looked like, to get a real feel for his experience. Because many of the details I'm about to share with you are not known by most people who would later make their assumptions about whether or not Yurchenko was a real defector or a cunning disinformation officer. Because remember, as we learned in episode 1, 90 days after he first stepped foot on American soil, Vitaly Yurchenko would disappear, would run away from the CIA. And those who believed he was a real defector especially those in the FBI, often blamed Yurchenko's disappearance on the CIA's treatment of him during this resettlement process. So I wanted to find out, what were his relationships like with the CIA and the FBI? Were they really all that different? Ronald Kessler, a former DC journalist and the author of the book Escape from the CIA about Yurchenko's time here, has strong opinions about the differences between the FBI and the CIA's handling of defectors and of Yurchenko in particular.
There was a wide gap between the way the FBI and the CIA handled Yurchenko. On the one hand, the CIA had this idea that defectors are malcontents and there's something wrong with them because they decided to defect. It was just an incredibly idiotic attitude, whereas the FBI is and was the opposite. The FBI treated defectors like the incredible assets they are, tried to develop camaraderie with them, tried to give them whatever they wanted within reason, treated them with respect. And so, of course, Yurchenko picked up on that. In the FBI, they're taught that defectors really do try to help the U.S. on principle, that they realize that the Soviet Union is ghastly, and that they genuinely want to help. That's often the real reason they want to defect. Whereas at the CIA, the idea is, well, they're just trying to feather their own nest. They're trying to make money. They're misfits. Totally different.
Many in the CIA would beg to differ with this description, and there are many cases where they would be right. My experience talking to folks was that generally, though, and especially at this time, the CIA did not encourage much camaraderie with defectors, whereas the FBI really understood the value of putting defectors at ease and forming trust. In the case of Vitaly Yurchenko, it is true that he bonded quickly and early on with his FBI handlers Reed Brose and Mike Rochford, and not as much with his CIA team. Mike spoke some Russian, which Yurchenko loved.
Yurchenko wanted to go on walks in between our debriefings, and I'd always go on the walks with him because I liked to walk with him. I used to play basketball up there. Basketball court right across the street from the Safehouse. I'd go there on Saturdays. I mean, you get like collegiate level players playing. We'd walk around and we'd sit on the sidelines and watch these guys playing basketball and stuff.
Reed also remembers Yurchenko fondly.
Would you say you and Yurchenko became friends?
Yeah.
Did you enjoy hanging out with him?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I did. We had a good time.
Yurchenko told Mike and Reed, though mostly Mike in Russian, stories about his family, his brother, his adopted son Peter, who was having trouble and acting out. He told them stories from his time in DC in the 70s when he was working at the Russian embassy. When he was there, actually, Yurchenko had become very close with an FBI agent named Ed Joyce. Joyce, who passed away in 2021, was the FBI liaison with Yurchenko during the years he worked in DC. The men would get lunches at top restaurants together. They would go to sports games or go on double dates with their wives. Joyce even invited Yurchenko to his daughter's wedding. Ed Joyce told Kessler that because of the friendship they built, Yurchenko really opened up about his disappointments about the Soviet Union and his admiration for America.
Ed Joyce, told me how Yurchenko seemed to admire America. He was, impressed by the restaurants that they went to and things like that. Where he clearly thought a lot highly of America and would, in fact, complain about Russia, about the Soviet Union, would complain about conditions there.
In the same FBI spirit of building common ground and friendship, Reed decided that he and Mike would teach Yurchenko to play golf.
So I found an old lawnmower in the garage. So I mowed and set up a chip and putt area. There's one y'all do. Oh, we play a little golf.
Reed and I were funny. We bought him a putter, and we made a par 3 golf course out of the grounds there. It was like 10 acres or something like that. And so it was pretty cool. I mean, he was just
cheap old putter. But now I don't know who has that putter. I think Reed does.
As for his CIA debriefers, Colin Thompson, for one, did not share Mike and Reed's warm feelings for Yurchenko. And the feeling was mutual. I asked Colin what Yurchenko was like.
He certainly wasn't charming. He was never charming. Look, he was a KGB officer. He'd been around a long time. He was respected within the KGB for his service and his rank and so forth, and he expected to be respected here. And that's exactly what we did. And that's why I didn't much care for him ever. And he probably didn't care much for me either. But he was a professional. I knew it and treated him that way. And he knew I was a professional. He treated me that way. And so that worked that way. And so while we had our differences from time to time, mostly they were submerged. We got along all right, you know.
I asked him what the differences were.
Oh, it was a bit of a hypochondriac, as I say. He was fussy. One of the problems was keeping him entertained. I don't know, never did really find out what his interests were.
Okay, so Colin, who isn't really much of a golfer himself, clearly wasn't out there playing putt-putt. But I asked Reed if any of the other CIA folks played any games with Yurchenko.
Only time that I saw any people who were doing interviews was when they were interviewing. They would interview and leave. They would leave, but they had their security there, and they left it all up to security. And these are young guys.
They were certainly young. Here's John Fitzpatrick, one of Yurchenko's bodyguards at Coventry.
I can't believe you're 22. Okay.
To not lose this fact, I spent my 23rd birthday with Vitaly Yurchenko.
What?
Watching the Miss America pageant.
What? Oh my God.
So we could, but I'll just finish that anecdote. He told me, because he had been assigned in Washington. I think he served for 5 years in Washington in the 70s. And he became enamored of the Miss America pageant during that time and was especially proud of his ability to choose the winner during the broadcast.
What?
And whoever won in 1985, he picked her out of the finals.
Wait, so he was right. He could actually pick them out?
He was that night that he was bragging about his ability to pick the winner, he picked the winner.
On your birthday.
And it happened to be it's how I remember spending my 23rd birthday with the Russian defector.
I just love that story. I called John Fitzpatrick back with a better phone connection, and John echoed that the relationship Yurchenko had with the CIA was more strained than it was with the FBI, and offered an interesting take.
He seemed to be more welcoming and respectful to the FBI guys than the CIA guys. And I mean that by his interlocutors. The security guards were just his boys. We were all sort of in 20s and early 30s. He understood that idea of a custodial deal, that we were not substantive partners of his. And so we were sort of, I'll say, in a slightly separate group than the folks that would be interviewing him. He was a little warier of the CIA folks who had a little bit more control over his future. And so the Bureau guys didn't have that responsibility towards him, and it made things a little bit cleaner for them, I think.
The young guards were all from the CIA Office of Security. This is Dan Payne again.
Initially, he didn't say a whole lot to us. As time went on, we got to know him a little bit better. He got more comfortable with us. But keep in mind, most of his bodyguards, like I think at the time I was 26 maybe. I was 26, and probably the oldest bodyguard he had was in his early 30s. He was in his 50s, and he was already a general designate in the KGB. He was going to get promoted to general. To him, and in fact, he used to refer to us as the boys. That was what he called us. We were at two different levels in our career, two different levels in what we knew and didn't know as far as the intelligence business was concerned. We were there to just protect him.
You did not become best friends with?
No, I wouldn't say anybody I wouldn't say any of his bodyguards became best friends with him. We were there to do a job, and sometimes sometimes he didn't like what we had to do as part of the job truly to protect him. I'll get to that a little later, but when we moved to the other safe house, Yurchenko liked nature, and there was a big wooded area in the back. And, he would always want to go in that back area, and because there was a lake back there, and he found a beaver dam. And so he used to like to watch the beavers build the dam. But we had to go with him. When he went out into the woods, we were with him. And I think he felt a little bit closed in, maybe.
Remember, everyone who was with Yurchenko during his stay in America referred to him only by his alias, Alex, for security purposes.
But just like following him into the woods, that used to piss him off to no end. And we tried to explain it to him. Alex, we have to be with you. He would tell us, he says, "Gentlemen, I am not going to run away." And we would tell him, we would say, "Alex, we're not worried about you running away. We're worried about somebody doing something to you. And that's why we're here." We couldn't let him go back there alone. But we gave him a little bit of breathing space. We'd give him a little bit of room. We'd stay back, but we'd keep him in sight. And so we tried to overcome things that way. But I wouldn't say he was friendly with us, but not unfriendly either. He was almost indifferent.
Dan recalls setting a tone early in their relationship.
Yurchenko was always a little bit afraid of me because we were taking a walk one time, and he said to me, "Dan, do you have a knife?" I said, "Yeah, I got a knife." And I pulled a switchblade out of my pocket, and I clicked it open. And he says, "Ah, you have a special knife." I said, "Yeah, that's right, Alex, it's a special knife." He said, "Can I see it?" And I looked at him, and I turned it around so that I was handing him the handle. And I started to hand him the handle, and I said, "You just remember, Alex, I have a gun too." And I handed him the knife, and I took a couple of steps back, and he looked at it, and then he handed it back to me, and it was like after that, I didn't have a whole lot of trouble with Alex.
According to Reed and Mike's debriefing notes, Yurchenko complained a lot about his security detail. Here's a bit. Yurchenko complained about the guards, whom he described as young, inexperienced, and unaccustomed to wearing guns. Yurchenko was not allowed out of their sight if he were out of the house, which bothered him a great deal. He complained about being a prisoner. Yurchenko asked the debriefers on a few occasions to speak to the guards about openly displaying their weapons. He said that it would be embarrassing to him if a stranger came and saw them with their guns. It's interesting because I can see this from both sides, right? Yurchenko was a rising colonel, which, especially in the corruption of the Communist Party in those days, meant he really got special treatment. He could fly all over the world when no one else in the country was allowed to leave. He had money. He had thousands of people working for him. So Yurchenko wanted to be treated like a VIP, or at least like someone the CIA trusted and didn't need to micromanage. His ego and his pride did not mix well with the young guards who were trying their best to do their job and found him quirky, grumpy, and even funny. At one point, the guards took him shopping for bedroom slippers. Unaccustomed to the concept of a mall, Yurchenko was overwhelmed by choice. The guards got antsy because staying in one place for too long was a security liability, and eventually they just made a decision for him and grabbed a random pair of slippers. Yurchenko did not love that.
It was kind of like that with everything. It was like he wanted jeans and he wanted Levi's. Took him to a place to get Levi jeans. He picked which kind he wanted and picked the size he thought he wore. And I said to him, well, why don't you go try those on, Alex? I said, I'll be right outside. I said, go try those on. He said, no, they will fit. They will fit. And of course, he bought like 3 pairs and none of them fit. So we told him, Alex, give them back to us. We'll take them back. We'll get you the right size. And he wouldn't do it. And so he would just sit with his pants unbuttoned.
Dan says there were a few rather unfortunate, if humorous, mishaps that also did not go over too well with Yurchenko. Now remember, the guards were in their 20s. So one night after Yurchenko went to bed, Dan tried to make himself a grilled cheese sandwich. Only he set off the fire alarm. This one was hardwired. You couldn't just pull out the batteries. You had to break it apart, basically.
So I went back to the stove and I hear footsteps coming down the stairs. And standing in the doorway of the kitchen is Yurchenko in his boxer shorts with his hands on his hips, just staring at me. And he goes, Dan, you will not cook anymore tonight. And I said, Alex, I said, I'm really sorry. I said, I apologize. I said, I'm not going to go back to bed, Alex. It's fine. I'm sorry. And so he turned around kind of like in a huff, and I hear footsteps going back up the stairs. So 1 o'clock, we change shifts, and the new bodyguard comes on duty, and there's no TV. He's got about as far in the book as he can stand to read that night. And so in the basement, we had a big basement, and we had a dartboard set up in the basement. So he goes down into the basement, and his name is John. John's throwing darts into the dartboard. And then that gets kind of boring, so he starts backing up and throwing the darts harder and harder, and he keeps backing up further and further until he's literally at the other end of the basement, and he's wailing these darts at the dartboard, and he's missing the dartboard, and he's hitting the wall. And that wall is the one wall that went straight up into Yurchenko's bedroom and was right by his headboard. So all Yurchenko could hear is as these darts are hitting the wall. So Yurchenko comes down the stairs. It goes into the basement, same thing, in his boxer shorts, his hands on his hips, and he's looking at John, and he goes, John, you have all day to play darts. You must play darts now. 3 o'clock in the morning, you must play darts now. And John says, Alex, I'm sorry. I'll put the darts away, go back to bed. I apologize. And so John had no idea that, I had woken him up with the fire alarm. And so the next day, Rochford came to do debriefings. And Yurchenko goes up to Rochford. He says, Mike, the boys, they keep me up all night last night. This is your plan, no?
Mike remembers it too.
Yurchenko would sometimes take me aside because I was the youngest debriefer there and say, oh, Mike, you got to go talk to this guard, tell him not to do this or that. Is okay. But, and then I go down and at first I took it real seriously. I'd start kind of lecture him, and then I realized this is bullshit. So I go down and I go, okay, I'm down here, I'm spanking you, just so you know, I'm telling you, you're doing a bad job, but you're doing a great job, don't worry, because this guy's being a jerk. And and we'd all laugh, and I'd say, but try not to play darts at midnight or whatever, because that wakes them up. And, they were just perfect. They were good guards.
He was finicky about the guards and sometimes annoyed with them. but he also showed them kindness. He could be dark and broody, sure, but also almost avuncular? Here's John Fitzpatrick again.
There was a certain affinity he had for us being security guys, and I use that term, my term, not something he did, but because he was a security officer, he understood our roles and the idea of, shifts and coverage and being there 4 days at a time. And so he was alternately annoyed with us or hospitable to us, depending on his mood. Because we were in the house with him. Somebody was in the house with him all the time. So here, my boys, let's have something to eat. We'll sit together in the kitchen and we'll do that. So he was, those are aspects of his, humanity. He was also, he would brood and not want anything to do with anybody and, walk ahead of you. Even as you were walking with him around the property, he'd want to be, alone at times. So he had, he had moods and they were, at each end of the spectrum. I remember one night we were out for a walk. The sky was clear and there was a prominent moon. And he told me a story about how to tell whether the moon was waxing or waning. And he said, you take your right hand, and if you could hold your hand up to the crescent moon and cup it like a woman's breast, then it is waxing. The moment of, him, here's a guy in his mid-50s and a guy in his 20s, and he's telling this tale, and he might have told me that this was what he learned from his father or he learned from someone, and he's passing down this sort of way of doing it. And I'm thinking, here's the absurdity of this man talking to me about cupping a woman's breast. It's funny, and it shows a certain, I'm wistful about that memory, I guess, because it's so goofy. But it also shows that he had a more human side to him.
There was one CIA officer whom Yurchenko took a real shine to. Rick, his other debriefer, who was known as Phil. Phil spoke some Russian, which put Yurchenko at ease. Not enough to conduct the debrief in Russian, but enough to get by in conversations that Yurchenko really enjoyed. When Yurchenko had learned that Phil would be taking a day off for his wedding, he wrote a message on a 5-ruble note and presented it to Phil as a wedding present. Dear Phil, it said, on the day of your wedding, I wish you to be happy and lucky. He signed it, Alex.
He got along very well with Phil. That was his handler. He got along remarkably well. And in fact, before Phil went on to his next overseas assignment, he brought his wife to the Safehouse one day to have dinner with Yurchenko. This was a big thing for Yurchenko. I mean, we literally, every piece of food in the house went on that table because he liked Phil and he wanted to be very respectful toward the wife. So he got along well with Phil.
The fact that Phil brought his bride, who lacked security clearance, to the top secret safe house was definitely against the rules of secrecy that makes a safe house safe. At first, the FBI and Phil's bosses at the CIA were furious, but it was clear that one guy wasn't pissed at all. And that guy was Vitaly Yurchenko, who for the first time felt like a real human being having a couple over to his house for dinner. Phil's bosses could quickly tell it had made a big positive difference in Yurchenko's demeanor, and they allowed the exception. Unfortunately for Yurchenko, Phil was only able to stay on the case for the first few weeks. He departed for language training to prepare him for his next assignment in Rome. While all this is going on, let's not forget that Yurchenko thinks he is dying of cancer, or at least says he thinks that, and it's not going over too well with some people in the safe house. What was this stomach thing? How real was it? After Phil left, acting as Yurchenko's only CIA debriefer began to weigh on Colin, who was working 7 days a week and whose patience was growing thinner, especially with Yurchenko's constant complaints about his stomach.
So a lot of the, I'm not feeling well, my stomach hurts.
As far as I can tell, Yurchenko had some form of stress-induced gastritis, but he believed, or at least he said he believed, that he was dying of stomach cancer and refused to accept any diagnosis or prescription other than his own.
He wanted these little black specks of something or other that only you could get in the Soviet Union, except in Coney Island in New York. So we had to send a cable up. I think the FBI did it for us, but they had to send a cable up to New York, sending somebody out to Coney Island to get these little medicine things. Everybody's saying, "What are you doing that for?" So he gets this little tin of these tiny little black things. I don't know if they worked it out, but he said they did. So, a typical hypochondriacal approach to things.
Fun fact, I looked into these seeds. The National Institute of Health did a study in 2008 concluding that, though, quote, folkloric in its origin, black seed significantly prevented gastric ulcer formation. Particular, eccentric, and perhaps annoying though he may have been, entirely crazy, Yurchenko was not. Here's author Ronald Kessler again. He criticized the CIA's treatment of Yurchenko and Colin's impatience with Yurchenko's health in particular.
Yurchenko had an upset stomach, an irritable stomach, and there was some basis for it. But he worried that he had cancer, and he didn't accept the doctor's reassurance that it was just this minor stomach issue. So he was always worried about that. That's something that Colin Thompson would make fun of behind his back.
To be fair to Colin, doctors did actually diagnose Yurchenko with hypochondria. Though it took some digging. I can't believe this. I was able to find the first doctor who treated Yurchenko.
My name is Sam Harrington. I was a practicing gastroenterologist in Washington, D.C.
Sam had a contract with the CIA, almost always to treat CIA employees, very rarely a CIA asset. In his entire career, he had only treated 3 assets, and the first of them was Vitaly Yurchenko. As a result, he says he remembers it well. Before the patient's arrival, the CIA had described the man's abdominal issues and asked Sam what tests they should get done beforehand. When they came in, they had the results of his blood panels.
Late summer, I was asked if I would be willing to see a person described as a very important asset under curious circumstances. The person came in with 3 handlers. One man came into my office with the patient, who was dressed, I remember heavy clothes, an obvious wig, and as I said, makeup by Dutch boy paint. I mean, it was, you could not see it. It was just one of those things you couldn't look away from. But that's how they do it.
Okay. And so you're with a straight face now, you're looking at this man in clown makeup, more or less.
Correct. Yeah. And I really had to try and keep a straight face.
He's told that he's talking to a Swiss banker. Sam had been told that Yurchenko's mother died of cancer, but the patient showed no signs of cancer himself.
My final diagnosis was that he was hypochondriacal. My overwhelming impression was that he had no medical issues of importance, that his symptoms were not consistent with any disease of importance, that he was very suggestible.
When you say suggestible, what does that mean?
It means that whatever I offered as a potential co-symptom, he had it. Well, sir, Mr. So-and-so, do your teeth itch? Yes. Do your stools glow in the dark? Yes. Does this hurt here? Yes.
Sam Harrington had seen many people who tried to fake pain for drug-seeking reasons and said that Yurchenko's behavior was different.
I didn't think he was play acting. I think he was genuinely a hypochondriac who's looking for a reason to be in my office, or who's looking for something, whatever hypochondriasis leads to in terms of a need. So, there's certain ways to palpate the abdomen that sort of let you know that the patient is faking it without really, they're not faking it as in drug seeking, which is one reason to fake things, but faking it as in, well, maybe this will get me more tests, or maybe this will get me more attention, maybe this will get me more involved.
Sam had done all of those. He was never asked to do any follow-up visits, and he was worried he hadn't made his overall concerns loud enough.
I thought he was totally unreliable, and that as what we call a historian, and that the agency should know that. And somehow I couched that in diplomatic medical terms, hoping that they would call me in and say, why? And which is what you're doing now, but my memory was fresher at the time, and I would have been able to answer more accurately. All I can say is that I found him to be completely unconvincing in terms of any medical issue.
After his meeting with Sam Harrington, Yurchenko would insist on seeing a variety of other specialists. Reed Brose was sure that the stomach issues were related to Yurchenko's stress, particularly at the first Safehouse, where, Reed points out, he had every reason to feel nervous about being killed. Though his stomach got slightly better once they were in the peaceful countryside at Coventry, Yurchenko still insisted on cooking quite peculiar food most of the time he was in the States.
He was convinced he had stomach cancer. And we took him to all kinds of doctors. And of course, he didn't have stomach cancer, but he never believed the doctors. He was certain that he had stomach cancer. And the food he used to eat was so bland. It was horrible. And it, like initially when we were at the old Safehouse, the original Safehouse, we offered to bring in a cook. And he didn't want to cook. I'll make my own food. Well, he had this penchant for cow tongue, and it was the most disgusting, because he would take this huge cow tongue and he would put it in a pot and boil it for hours. And of course, the skin on it would start shriveling up and everything. And I have to say, the psychologist that we had on the team, and we became very good friends after that. Worked together for years after that. He passed away not too long ago, but he had a great sense of humor. Yeah, he was an extremely funny individual. He came into the Safehouse one day when Yurchenko was, boiling this cow tongue. And I said, I called him by his name and I said, hey, take a look at what's for dinner. And I lifted the lid on the pot, and he looked into the lid and he looked back real quick and pardon the expression, but he said, God damn, by tomorrow we'll be eating donkey dick. We all started laughing, and of course Yurchenko would expect us to eat with him, and it was like, oh my God, I would never eat it. But one of my colleagues decided he was going to eat with him, and must have put a half gallon of ketchup on that cow tongue before he ate it.
Here's Mike Rochford.
He made us eat this beef tongue crap that he made every day for lunch. It was, God almighty, it was terrible.
You ate it?
Yeah. Well, not always. Sometimes I go, oh my God, put a little mustard on it, you could eat anything, right? But it was terrible.
While at the Safehouse, Yurchenko was finding his footing and friendship with the FBI, keeping some distance with the CIA, disgusting all who tried to eat with him, and bemusing his doctors. Meanwhile, the SE division was dealing with the fallout of his first revelation, and it was not, shall we say, going well. I'm talking about the mole Yurchenko had revealed back in Rome, a CIA traitor that Yurchenko knew only as Mr. Robert. It had been obvious to the SE leadership that the man he was describing was a CIA officer named Edward Lee Howard. But the thing was, capturing Ed Howard was becoming a nightmare, one where everything seemed to be going wrong. Was that a coincidence? There was a lot about the Edward Lee Howard case that was not great for the CIA. Ed Howard had been trained to go to Moscow, and at the last minute, after being taught about TA, the cable tapping operation we talked about in episode 1, and about several valuable Soviet assets, including Vanquish, Howard failed his polygraph. Not once, but 3 times. He lied about recreational drug use, heavy drinking, cheating during some of his training at the farm, and it turns out he had even stolen money out of a woman's purse on a plane for the thrill of it. Also not great was that the CIA had made the mistake of firing Howard. He was a reckless, highly trained officer who knew tons of classified intelligence, and now he had an axe to grind. And there were quite a few axe-grinding moments that the CIA should have warned the FBI about. To clarify that a little, the CIA is not an organization that can arrest people. It has no law enforcement function. It's an intelligence gathering agency. The FBI, however, does have that power. Also, by law, the CIA is specifically prohibited from collecting foreign intelligence about the domestic activities of U.S. citizens. The FBI is a domestic intelligence agency, and it can spy on Americans. So, when the CIA suspected that one of its former American employees living in America might be a threat to national security, the protocol would have been to tell the FBI, who could get a wiretap, gather the proof they needed, and make an arrest. Now, in the case of Edward Howard, the CIA might have alerted the FBI, say, when Howard made belligerent, drunk crank calls to the CIA's Moscow station after he was fired. It didn't. It probably should have told the FBI that Howard's alcohol use had worsened and that he was arrested for discharging his firearm in a bar fight, almost shooting a college student. Things got so bad that the agency arranged for psychiatric treatment for Howard. Howard admitted to a psychiatrist that he had once considered walking into the Soviet embassy to defect, and still the CIA never told the FBI. I spoke with David Major, a former senior FBI executive and the founder and president of the CI Center, Counterintelligence Center, the nation's leading counterintelligence training and education firm, where David also teaches. At the time of our story in 1985, David Major was at the White House serving as the director of intelligence at the National Security Council, personally debriefing President Reagan on all matters of intelligence. I met David in his home in Delaware, where he, his wife, and their incredibly friendly hound, Ruby, live in a peaceful community near the water. He remembered Ed Howard, and the reason it was a challenge to catch him, very well. The CIA, he explains, had sat on their intel about Howard in part because they were embarrassed.
The reason I didn't tell him everything is that they had screwed this case up. They had some information on him. They did not. And they just chose not to tell us because it was embarrassing to them, because when they decided to fire him, they didn't tell us about the guys.
A big part of this was the lack of trust between the agencies and their rivalry. Generally, the FBI resents the CIA for being elitist, Ivy Leaguers who make their living breaking rules in countries all over the world. The CIA resents the FBI for being blue-collar, bureaucratic rule followers with a loose definition of need-to-know confidentiality.
We could spend many hours talking about how much the FBI and CIA hate each other. The CIA sees itself as being the smarter, more, we know languages, we can live overseas, and FBI agents are seen as kind of, unsophisticated, beer-swilling, or even worse, teetotaling Mormons, and who don't really know anything about the world and aren't sophisticated.
That was Stephen Engelberg again, the New York Times intelligence reporter at the time. Not only would the CIA have to admit to its sibling rival, the FBI, that it had been betrayed by one of its own, and not only would it have to come clean about its hubris in keeping certain red flags from the FBI, but as if that wasn't bad enough, on top of it, they'd have to very awkwardly admit that this mole they now needed to capture was one of the most highly trained spies in the agency. See, Ed Howard had taken the CIA's Internal Operations, or IO course, which is basically the CIA's version of Top Gun. It was a course for elite officers who had been selected to work in what they call hostile environments, places with oppressive surveillance like East Berlin or Moscow or China. In the course, officers learn real James Bondy stuff. They learned about brush passes, where you walk by someone on the street and you hand them something but nobody can see it. Or dead drops, where you conceal a package and leave it somewhere secretly for an agent to pick up later. They learn evasive driving. They learn about costumes and prosthetics. And most importantly, they learn how to spot surveillance and how to evade that surveillance without the surveillant realizing until it's too late. To teach that specific skill, the CIA partnered with the FBI. FBI agents taught courses at the farm about their own surveillance techniques, and then their agents would tail the IO students to help them practice spotting surveillance and shaking it off. David Major mentioned he himself had taught FBI surveillance techniques at the IO course. I was a little dumbfounded, and then I wondered, had David been teaching when Edward Lee Howard was a student?
Did you personally trained him on surveillance detection?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what? How small of a world is this?
How good of a student was he?
As an average student, nothing special. They flunk them out of the course if they can't get through that. It's a flunk out course. It's the SEAL training for CIA officers. It's like the SEALs training. If you don't make it through, they'll take an entire class and they'll fire them. They won't certify them. That's very rigid training.
Ed Howard was not only a deadly liability, a mole who needed to be caught before he could do any more harm, but the fact that he took the IO course meant he was also a mole who was trained by members of the FBI, in this case, David Major himself, specifically to evade the FBI. Though the CIA told the FBI immediately what Yurchenko had told them, the description of Mr. Robert, because of how much of an embarrassment it all was, they did not add that they were pretty immediately sure that that description matched the identity of a man named Edward Lee Howard for a few more days until they could be really sure. Then, once the FBI was alerted to his identity, the Bureau was slow to get moving on the warrants. And in the meantime, Howard was able to rush away for a sudden trip to Europe. He told his boss that his grandmother had passed away, and he flew to Zurich, then Vienna. Only Vienna is where Howard had first met with his KGB handlers, and Howard's grandma was very much still alive. If the KGB hadn't been behind Yurchenko's defection in Rome, they would have at least known that he disappeared there and was unaccounted for. And since Yurchenko had handled Howard, the KGB needed to warn their American asset that there was a chance he might be in danger. And they managed to do it all before the FBI had even begun to tail him. And by the time he returned from Europe, once the FBI did begin their surveillance, Howard noticed it pretty much instantly. The undercover agents working on a pothole near his house, the plane circling overhead, and he immediately began to craft an escape plan. On Friday, September 20th, 1985, about 2 months after Yurchenko had outed him on first arrival, Howard walked up to a man in the produce section of the grocery store who was supposed to be inconspicuously tailing him and suggested a meeting with the FBI on Monday. He realized they were on to him, and he thought if he cooperated, maybe they would go easier on him. Or at least, that was the lie he told to lull the FBI into a false sense of security. The next morning, Edward Lee Howard and his wife Mary Howard drove around looking for an ideal place for Ed to escape, using a top-secret technique he had learned in the IO course.
One of the things that was used at that time, and it's in a number of books and things now, so we can talk about it, is the Jack in the Box.
That was John Cipher. You met him last episode, and not only did John take the IO course, he also served as station chief in Moscow, where he implemented that training. Plus, he's also been an instructor at the farm, the CIA's covert training facility.
And so what would happen is someone like Ed Reed Howard or whatever would be driving, watching where their surveillance are, manipulating them, going over a ridge or turning a corner at a certain point, and then the person in the passenger seat would get out and flee into the bushes or down a staircase or something like that. And then the driver would continue on so that when the surveillance car got into a place to see again, it would look like nothing happened. And what the driver would do is deploy this thing out of a gym bag, and it would pop up like a jack-in-the-box. And it had essentially a incredibly well-developed mask with a hat or whatever, exactly what that person was wearing, so that the surveillance cars that's driving behind would see what was there before, two people in the car, and they had a little button that could turn the head and things. So that car would then continue to drive on and take surveillance away from where the person who escaped is. So that person who has escaped would then make sure that they're not under surveillance and go meet a source.
Or, in this case, flee the country. That night, Ed and Mary called their babysitter and headed to a restaurant for a dinner date. On their way home, Mary drove around the specific blind corner they had selected. As she did, her husband rolled out of the moving vehicle and their very homemade version of a jack-in-the-box bounced up to take his place in the passenger seat. They had made this thing with a mop stick, a hanger with his coat on it, and a wig. When Mary got home, the men in the surveillance van watched her pull into the garage, and just as the couple hoped, mistook the dummy for her husband.
They saw what they think was Howard in the car. It was the jib, but they thought it was Howard because there were two silhouettes. They pull the car in, there's two silhouettes, two people. So we think he's still there.
Later, much to the dismay of the Bureau, it would come out that Howard's hijinks that evening hadn't even been entirely necessary. David Major explains that actually, the FBI had never seen Howard leave for dinner.
So he's not under surveillance. He should have been, but he wasn't. Now, there's a reason for that. Not a good reason, but the real reason. I'm not sure you should put this in the thing. I'm not sure. Let me tell you about it. Okay. When he gets back home with his wife and they're going to leave to go to dinner, she calls her girlfriend, the babysitter, and starts telling her girlfriend what she and her boyfriend had done the night before.
The babysitter calls her friend and talks about what the babysitter has been doing with her boyfriend.
That's right. But they're using Howard's phone. So the FBI is listening. And what do they hear? Some pretty graphic discussion. And as a result, the person listening to the phone is really interested in it. And just at that time, they pull out. They leave.
So, where the jack-in-the-box worked perfectly was in reassuring the surveillance team that while they had missed the couple leaving, all was well, they thought, when they watched what appeared to be both husband and wife returning from dinner.
Well, at least he's here. That's okay. We didn't lose him.
Later that evening, Mary Howard did as instructed by her husband and called his psychiatrist's phone number. When the answering machine told her to leave a message, she played a pre-recorded tape of her husband requesting to see his doctor that week. The FBI surveillance sitting in the van outside was satisfied that Howard was turning in for the evening, when in fact he was on his way to the airport. By the time the FBI finally realized Edward Lee Howard was missing, he was already in Helsinki. To recap here, Vitaly Yurchenko told us about 2 moles, and that is a huge deal. But one of them had slipped right through the FBI's fingers. So, was it coincidence that the first mole Yurchenko revealed just happened to escape? Edward Lee Howard lived out the rest of his days in Moscow as the KGB's prized American defector. Meanwhile, back at the Safehouse, America's prized Soviet defector, Vitaly Yurchenko, decided it was finally time to tell his handlers something else. Something big. He wanted the CIA to help reunite him with the love of his life, Valentina. The thing is, Valentina was married to her Soviet diplomat husband and lived in Montreal, Canada. So Yurchenko asked the CIA to secretly smuggle him over the border into Canada, help him meet with Valentina without her husband knowing, and then arranged for Valentina's defection to America, including all of her papers. What could possibly go wrong? More on that next time on The Redefector. The Redefector is a production of Waveland. I'm Julie Cohn, and I wrote and created the series. Jason Hoke is the executive producer, and he also produced and edited the series. Shane Freeman is our sound engineer. Additional production assistance provided by Leo Culp. Music by Robert Ellis. If you love the series, please make sure to leave a review and to tell a friend. Follow Waveland on Instagram at Waveland Media for more information on this series and more. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
I had heard something about the woman within the first month of his defection. He had had a relationship with the wife of a Russian diplomat that was currently assigned in Canada. I didn't know the extent of the relationship. As the dates started getting closer and closer that he was going to go to Canada and we were going to set it up so he could pitch her to come back with him, it was obvious that his idea, CIA was going to pay him a lot of money, which we did. Then he was going to go up and get the love of his life, this woman who was married to another diplomat, bring her back to the U.S., and they would live happily ever after.
Until such time that he died of cancer.
Yes, that was the plan.
Back in the 70s, when Vitaly Yurchenko had been stationed in D.C. and worked at the Soviet embassy there, he became friends with a blue-eyed, ash-blonde Soviet woman named Valentina Yeroskovskaya. Valentina was also a well-respected pediatrician who was very empathetic. By all accounts, her relationship with Yurchenko had started out platonically, with long walks and deep conversations, sometimes over McDonald's hamburgers they would eat together in the park. Over time, that friendship had allegedly blossomed into an affair. The FBI had watched Vitaly and Valentina together and listened as they sometimes spoke on the phone. I asked David Major, the head of intelligence at the National Security Council at that time, about it.
Did the FBI know that they had been lovers in D.C. before?
Yeah. We heard them talk on the telephone. Way back when.
Wow. And it was loving.
Well, that's how we understood it. Maybe they were interested in little children and they wanted to protect them. I don't know. What do you think? Let's not be naive about this.
The two had continued to see each other back in Moscow after they had both returned from their postings in the US. And if we were to believe him at his word, here Vitaly Yurchenko was, 5 years later, taking a leap of faith and pursuing his great love across the Iron Curtain before it was too late. From Waveland, I'm Julie Cohn, and this is The Redefector. This is Chapter 5, Valentina. The author Ronald Kessler was able to interview Jean Boisvert, the Yeroskovsky's neighbor in Montreal. In 1985, Boisvert was a 62-year-old writer and film producer who described Valentina as, quote, gorgeous, adding that she was, quote, of ideal proportions with curves in the right places. Valentina was always more talkative than her husband, he said, and she often wore trendy boots, miniskirts, and designer glasses. He described her husband, Alexander, or Alex, as a, quote, tall and very good-looking man, a mustache a la Clark Gable or Robert Taylor. I appreciate that he objectified them both. Also, let's all appreciate the fact that Vitaly Yurchenko chose Alex as his CIA codename, though he hadn't told David when he first walked into the embassy in Rome. And though he kept it from his own debriefers for a little while, this affair with Valentina seemed to be one of the reasons the Soviet colonel had chosen to defect in the first place. Here's Dan Payne again.
How did it come up that maybe he hatched this plan? Or did someone suggest that he find a partner, or?
No.
Just out of the blue?
This was something that this was part of his personal plan on what was going to happen with his life.
So you think it was part of his plan before he even came to America?
I think so, yeah.
Here's Milt Bearden, the deputy chief of the SE division.
He wanted to be reunited with his beloved girl that he'd had a fling with when he was in Washington before. It was part of his whole defection plan because she was out of the USSR, just up across the border in Canada, and he had it all figured out. He'll come here, get taken care of completely, get his beloved girl, and it'll be all just no problem, and happily ever after.
He waited several weeks after his initial defection to reveal to his FBI debriefer and friend, Mike Rochford, that he still loved Valentina.
He said, well, Mike, he said, I had a girlfriend when I was here. And he said, I don't remember if he said he had an affair with her in the Washington or when he went back. I don't remember. But it was clear that he had a relationship, and it was, a full-bore relationship with her. He's very affectionate toward her, and she love of his life, and she understood him and all that stuff. I mean, it was all that stuff that guys never talk about.
But he talked to you about it.
He talked to me and Reed about it, yeah.
Maybe when Yurchenko's mother died of cancer, it was a wake-up call to him about the brevity of his own life, especially considering he feared he was dying of the same disease. If you only had limited time on Earth, wouldn't you want to spend that time with the love of your life? Here's Colin Thompson.
Okay, but at a certain point you decide, well, he's kind of earned this, or what's the thinking there?
Well, no, we want him happy. I mean, for however good or bad he was, we had obligations to him. We wanted him to stay here. We wanted him, if we could, to be happy, to have a decent life. And so when he came up with the idea, we didn't have any great suggestions. Yes, we know Russian-speaking women. They're perfectly decent women. They're not married. Maybe at least you could talk to them in Russian. But he didn't take to that.
They quickly located Valentina's address in Montreal. She and her husband lived in a brick high-rise on a hill that led up to Mount Royal Park and down to the Ritz-Carlton. The only problem was that Valentina wasn't actually in the country. Some early surveillance revealed that she was in Moscow. She had been there since July, when it appears she and Yurchenko had spent time together before he left for Rome. While the U.S. and Canadian intelligence services waited for her return, which was expected in about a week, Colin made sure Yurchenko understood that he and Valentina would be taken care of. Yurchenko would be receiving a salary of $62,500 a year for life, roughly what a full army colonel made at the time. He would also be able to keep all the furniture in the safe house that he had picked out, and would get insurance and a car. After much discussion at headquarters, it was decided that in addition, the CIA would offer him a bonus of $1 million, tax-free, to help show the country's gratitude for his service. In return for the payments, Yurchenko signed a contract agreeing to continue to cooperate with the CIA and do nothing to harm the interests of the United States. Once Valentina and her husband came back to Canada, Canadian intelligence studied the couple's movements. 3 days a week, Valentina and Alexander walked to the Soviet consulate together. Valentina had her pediatrician office hours, and she and Alexander returned together at noon for their lunch at their apartment. On September 26th, however, Alexander was to attend a luncheon outside the consulate, and the Canadians decided that would be the best window for Yurchenko's visit. As he prepared to leave for Canada, Yurchenko was thrilled. Here's his bodyguard, Dan, remembering his mood before he set out.
Oh, he was very excited to be going up there, almost giddy, if you will, about going up there.
Colin says they flew Yurchenko to an Air Force base in New York near the Canadian border. They figured it would be easier to smuggle him over the border without papers than to do so at an airport, and they were right. Soon, they were in Canada, driving north. Yurchenko and Colin both had rooms that night in the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal. Yurchenko was so excited he barely slept. As he opened the paper, still giddy and even more excited for the day, he froze. At the bottom of the front page of the Montreal Gazette, a 3-column headline read, "High-ranking KGB officer defected, U.S. officials say." In it, the article said, Vitaly Yurchenko dropped from sight in Rome on July 24th and is believed to be supplying the CIA with identities of scores of agents and disinformation specialists. The story had actually broken the day before in the Washington Times in a column written by Ralph de Toledano with the headline, "The Missing KGB Link," which was paired with a second article in the news section that had an even more condemning headline. "Number 5 man for KGB, now singing to the CIA?" ? In it, de Toledano mentions the recent frenzy in the espionage community and asked whether there might be a reason for it all. He writes, "And there was. That reason is named Vitaly Yurchenko, or Yurchenko, choose your own transliteration of the Cyrillic, the number 5 man in the KGB. He holds in his head the identities of scores of Soviet agents in Europe and of the additional thousands of sleepers, not to mention those witting and unwitting individuals whose job it is to spread disinformation and confusion in the West. Others who have broken with the Kremlin since, quote, knew only a fraction of what Vitaly Yurchenko knew," he added. These articles were Vitaly Yurchenko's worst nightmare. It was a violation of the only thing he had asked the CIA for in return for his defection at the outset. He had made it clear from the moment he walked into the U.S. Embassy in Rome, and he had continued to make it clear to each of his debriefers once he arrived. Here's Colin, one of his CIA debriefers.
The one thing he didn't want, or one of the few things he didn't want, was his name in public, which could confirm the fact that he had defected, and that then his family would then be subjected to retaliation.
And here's Reed, his FBI debriefer.
He did not want the KGB to know where he was. If they can't find me, if they can't know where I am, that I'm not dead. If they find me and if they know that I'm alive and I'm talking, they will go against my family. And he had his wife and his son, and we did discuss that.
Here's Ronald Kessler.
I think the biggest slap in the face was that the one condition he laid down for his defection and cooperation with the CIA was that his defection would not be made known publicly. In other words, the KGB would be, left to wonder what happened to him. Did he, fall off a cliff? Did he commit suicide? Because Yurchenko did not want any repercussions to blow back on his family in Russia. And if it got out that he really had defected, the family could face a lot of retribution and punishment.
What's particularly horrible about this leak, and though he would deny it until his death, it seems that the director of the CIA himself, Bill Casey, had been the source of the leak.
I only met him 4 or 5 times in his office. All when these kind of crises. And he mumbled. For real. He's very decisive. Very decisive. And he understood the spy business. As far as I was concerned, a great director.
It seems like he might have leaked the Yurchenko news.
That we all thought he would, yeah. But I mean, everybody's screaming. I remember people saying, "What's the fucking 7th floor? Would shut up." But I don't remember what made us think that.
The 7th floor was where the bigwigs' offices were, including Bill Casey's.
Okay. But do you, if you had to guess why he would have done something like that, what would be the logic?
Oh, he's a political animal, and the Russians and stuff. He wasn't leaking it for in any kind of way, except he was careless, in my opinion.
Mike Rochford puts it a little more bluntly.
Casey, I mean, that son of a bitch, that director of the agency. Look, we heard from the debriefers and some of the guards that who also did guarding for Casey, that Casey was at these cocktail parties around Washington D.C. and he was throwing this shit out about Yurchenko's debriefings. That's where the leaks came from. So I'm sure there were other leaks from other people, but it's like, didn't need it.
Even if the news got out because of a bit of carelessness, it seems Casey also made zero attempts to put the genie back in the bottle. Ronald Kessler had spoken to Ralph de Toledano's editor, Mary Lou Forbes, back in the 80s. She told Kessler that when Ralph submitted his breaking news story, she reached out immediately to the CIA. Though they never officially comment, in the past, they'd strenuously urged the paper not to run certain stories when the agency worried it might harm ongoing operations or investigations. Mary Lou Forbes called the CIA and waited until George Lauder, the CIA's director of public affairs, could be reached. When he called her back, he simply said, "No comment." Forbes double-checked with him whether the article wouldn't jeopardize any ongoing operations, but still he said nothing. He did not urge her to hold the story. Kessler believes Casey didn't just accidentally get overheard talking about the story all over the Beltway. He thinks Casey did it on purpose.
William Casey let it be known that, in fact, the guy had defected because he wanted to hold that up as a sign that the CIA was effective and wanted to burnish his own image, to the point where when the Washington Times learned about the defection and wanted to do a story, they asked the CIA, "Do you have any comment? And would a story create any harm or difficulty?" And in other words, they were willing to hold the story if they were told that it would be harmful. And what did the CIA do? They came back a few days later and said, "No comment, no comment." In other words, confirming everything, confirming that there would be no problem if a story were run. Just really a scandal.
Stephen Engelberg wound up reading Ralph de Toledano's piece in the Washington Times the morning it was published on the 25th, and then researched and reported his own article about Yurchenko, which ran on the front page of the New York Times the following day. Overnight, it had become a huge story.
My story, I mean, it was quickly recognized as an important thing. I mean, this story was, lead of the paper, was the most important story in the next day's New York Times.
Stephen had not received the tip from a source. In fact, in his article, he credited the Washington Times for breaking the scoop. I asked him about where he thought the leak might have originated.
I mean, I have always suspected it must have been Casey that put this out. They were, there was a sort of constant effort to, get a bigger budget, burnish the reputation of the CIA. Casey was in no way a kind of career button-down espionage officer. He wasn't that type. I just think, if you think about these leaks, and it's all just speculative here, but if you think about my experience, intelligence is cavalierly handled by people who don't gather it. I think that would be sort of the axiom of my coverage of the CIA, that I would tend to try to find out secrets from people who had not put their lives and personal safety or their colleagues' lives on the line to get a piece of information. That an actual CIA case officer, let's say for Yurchenko, would be among the last people who would tell you something like this while the operation was unfolding.
Casey needed a win. Controversy was mounting over the CIA's help in mining Nicaraguan harbors. Plus, as noted, Casey wanted to make sure the agency kept its budget. It's possible, though tragic, that Bill Casey calculated Yurchenko was just the win he needed. In any case, Yurchenko felt gutted, but he didn't have time to dwell on it at that moment. It was time to go to Valentina's home, and nothing, not even a blown cover, was enough to deter him from finally seeing her. Just an hour after he saw his name all over the headlines, Vitaly left the lobby of his hotel with Canadian security officers.
They took him, from the hotel. It was just a few blocks. Walked over there into the building, up to her floor. The Canadian who was with him said, "There's your door. You're on your own." And he went and knocked on the door.
The agent stayed at the end of the hall to give Yurchenko some privacy. He knocked on the door, and then she answered. She was every inch as he remembered. Yurchenko told her his circumstances, that he had defected and that he hoped to run away with her. Should she choose to disappear with him, their financial future was already fully taken care of. Valentina, looking right at him, turned him down cold. The whole exchange took less than a few minutes. David Major remembers it well.
She says, "I loved you as a Russian, as a Soviet man, but I hate you as a defector. I never want to see you again." That's, as I understand, what she said. That's kind of crushing. What do you do? He comes back very, very depressed. Great love of his life. Rejected him. Amazing. Oh, she didn't choose to be a defector, and he did, even though they had talked about it when they were lovers in D.C. earlier.
Dan Payne remembers hearing about the incident too.
I wasn't with the team. I wasn't with the team that went to Canada, but I was at the Safehouse when he got back. So it was interesting. The way I was told by some of my colleagues of what went down was that he made contact with her, and she let him know that the KGB was aware of their relationship, and the KGB had interviewed her. The thing that got him was, again, I'm hearing this from my colleagues, she said to him, "In my eyes, you are dead." And that was just devastating to Yurchenko. Just absolutely devastating.
In other words, she had fallen in love with a colonel, not a traitor.
So she said to him, and it sounds like people said to you that she told him the KGB knew he was coming? Or knew that they'd had an affair?
They knew about their relationship with each other and that they had interviewed her about that relationship. He disappeared. They knew about the relationship. They interviewed her in the event that she might know something about it. Again, her comment, the big part of the conversation was, "In my eyes, you are dead." And that was absolutely devastating to Yurchenko.
And was that because he was a defector now as opposed to?
I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure whether she had concerns about her family or whether that was in the past. And she wanted to stay with her husband and raise their family. I don't know why the change of heart.
At the time, if you were a Soviet diplomat or intelligence agent posted in a Western country and you had children older than a toddler, the Soviet policy was to keep your children in the Soviet Union during the duration of your posting abroad. They were kept hostage, basically, to ensure the return of their parents from the tempting lands abroad. Now, Valentina had 2 daughters, one of whom had just gotten married that summer in the Soviet Union. I couldn't find the age of her second daughter. Yurchenko also had a 23-year-old married daughter and a 14-year-old adopted son. Yurchenko had nevertheless been confident that his feelings toward Valentina were mutual and that she would want to ride off into the sunset with him regardless.
I guess I'm trying to put myself in her shoes, which is like, if my kids are in Russia, I don't want to.
Precisely.
So I'm just trying to get a read on Yurchenko because I kind of, you knew him, I didn't know him. But was this a desperation or arrogance? Or how would you describe this concept that he didn't for a second think that she would hesitate?
My producer, Jason Hoke, was sitting with us during this conversation.
or he wouldn't be the first guy that thought of, things were a lot further with his girlfriend than they actually were.
Kind of the ultimate romantic gesture of in some weird ways, defecting and coming all the way across the world.
I really struggle to understand if Yurchenko was deluded or if he had real reason to believe Valentina would have been on board with something like this. On the one hand, it sounds selfish and pretty arrogant to think this woman would wave goodbye forever to her daughters, kick off her heels and run off into the sunset with a known defector on his deathbed, by the way. And in doing so, also become a traitor to her motherland with a target on her back, you know? On the other hand, by many accounts, Yurchenko was a really careful man. He claimed to have been slowly planning this defection for years. He had played the perfect hand in Rome, and after all, he had risen to the 5th highest rank of anyone in the KGB. Maybe Valentina's daughters were old enough to take care of themselves, and since Valentina and Vitaly had met as late as July in Moscow, just weeks before he defected, was it possible they had talked through the idea of running away together and then she had just changed her mind? An FBI source I spoke with said that back in August, when Yurchenko had gone missing, the KGB had questioned Valentina, wondering if she knew where he might be. And Yurchenko complained to one of his handlers that the KGB must have brainwashed her against him somehow. Mike Rochford found out about Yurchenko's trip to Canada only after Yurchenko returned. The CIA had kept the information about his travel under very tight wraps for security reasons.
We were encouraging. We said, yeah, well, of course, obviously, wonderful girl, and obviously she's loved her kids. So what can he, she wants to be around her kids. What, are you stupid? I mean, what do you expect from a mom? You know, if she comes with you, then her chances with her kids are 0. They're not going to bring their family. I mean, come on, think this out.
Meanwhile, the author Ronald Kessler, in his book, claims it went down quite differently. He claims that Valentina let Yurchenko into her apartment, wept, told him she loved him, but just couldn't bear to leave her family and hoped he understood. This painted a really different picture of Yurchenko to me, made him seem a little less deluded, at least. But it was also so different from what my sources had said. The problem was neither of our sources had heard the conversation firsthand.
Hold on, did anyone watch? Was the Canadian, did he kind of give them did he know what happened, or does anyone know what happened?
Not until we left. No.
And what did he say to you when he got back?
Not much. That's one of the problems. He never did talk about it.
Wow. So you don't know.
Just that she said no.
Because people have said, there's a lot of, I guess it must just be conjecture of what.
How would they know? There were 2 people there, and none of us is one of them. either of them.
If Yurchenko was a plant from the beginning, was this all a big charade? An elaborate way to make his disappearance later make sense? Or had this man truly intended to come to America for a woman and just misread the situation? It happens to the best of us. Promises we make at night or dreams we share in bed can evaporate in the harsh light of day. One thing we do know for sure, Valentina said no. And as for the details, Colin is right. No one was there except Vitaly Yurchenko and Valentina Yeroskovskaya. So I began to look for Valentina. I searched through archived newspapers, both in Russian and in English, trying to find out if Valentina had returned to the Soviet Union after this debacle, or if she had even done any interviews. Some papers said she had been sent back to Moscow immediately. But then the Russian embassy spokesperson said she was not recalled and called the accusation of her infidelity preposterous and incredibly rude. Many agree that she remained in Montreal until her husband's assignment was over. But there is 0 information on her after that. I just couldn't find anything definitive about her whereabouts or any way to get in touch with her. And then, months into this research, I suddenly had an idea. What if she was here in the States? Because after all, a lot of Soviet citizens moved west in the early 90s after the fall of the USSR. So I searched for her name, and Found nothing, but I did see that Alexander Yaroskovsky, her husband, had been a former research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School from 2000 to 2001. So I searched for his details instead and found a current U.S. address. The report said this man was 87, the right age, and it gave a phone number, which rang no answer, but at the very bottom of the background report, there's a section called Possible Relatives, and that's when I found her. Valentina Yaroskovskaya. I had forgotten the way Russian patronymics work. The ending of what we would call a person's last name is different depending on your gender. I had been searching for Valentina Yaroskovsky. Armed with this new information, I was finally able to find her. And guys, in an ironic twist, she lives in Washington, D.C. now, alone. Or at least no one else is listed as a resident at that address. The apartment is a stone's throw from Mount Alto, which is now the Russian embassy. It was a warm October day. Like, it hadn't quite gotten crisp yet. And my producer Jason and I were in a bright red pickup, the replacement for our first rental, which died on a highway. Oops. We pulled up to a beautiful little brick apartment building with greenery outside. We're in this pickup, which is a whole other story, but we're in our rental and we're sitting outside what appears to be, according to our research, where Valentina lives. And I feel so weird to just go knock or ring this doorbell and have this woman come down and to have to say, like, hi, I'm writing this article about arguably the worst week of your life. Do you want to talk? Is that the plan? I did email her. We don't have a phone. I can't call her.
Yeah.
This is my only option. I do this, right?
Yeah. And it's kind of the end of our trip. We've talked to so many people. And
I really want her to have a chance to say her side.
Yeah.
This is so awkward. Okay. Here we go. A note here. You do not live one half of a block away from the Russian embassy if you aren't still on good terms with your country. This was not the home of a person who had left Russia to get away. Given the proximity and depending upon her age, which I still don't know for sure, Valentina might even still work for the embassy somehow. Anyway, there was no doorbell outside, just a keypad with no ringing function. We tried dialing her apartment number, but that didn't work. The keypad, we learned, was only for keyless entry by the residents. It was not a way to call anyone inside. Did you see the mailbox names?
No.
There's no names on them? I mean, that's a lot of stairs. Stairs just to get to the stoop. I had to at least know if we had the right place. There's usually a margin of error with the software we use for finding people. Like, as an example, it rarely accounts for people dying, and I felt a real need to know, at the very least, if she was alive and living here. My only choice was to keep waiting, awkwardly, for someone to enter or exit the building so that I could ask them if an elderly Russian lady lived here and perhaps gain entry somehow. Then, we might be in luck. Finally.
Hi there.
Hi there.
Trying to get to the same place we are, I think.
The delivery guy used his cell phone to call the phone number listed for the package's recipient. He informed us this was the only way to contact residents at the building. Soon a woman came downstairs.
Can I ask you a quick question? Sure. We're here to see a woman named Valentina Yarovskaya. Do you know if she would be 302? No, is there an older Russian woman?
Oh, yeah, she's actually on this side. So she would be 302?
Yes, yeah, 302.
302, yeah.
She does live here? Okay.
Yeah. Is she expecting you guys?
No,
we were having trouble reaching her.
Yeah.
We just wanted to come by.
You're not going to do it?
If you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
What's your name?
My name is Julie Cohn.
Okay.
And yeah, we're here.
She wouldn't know us, but we were just trying to reach her and couldn't, so we showed up.
Oh, say hi. I didn't want to wake you up. This is not working.
Yeah, no, it doesn't work. That's why I said just leave it at the door.
Oh, gosh.
This is for us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Right. Julia Cohn?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Someone had opened the door to the apartment at the top of a flight of stairs, and the woman we had just met outside was speaking to that person. She pointed down to me, so I waved.
Hi there. We wanted to ask her a question about a story from the past. Okay. We're doing we're John, if I just
Okay, I couldn't see this woman, and I was afraid that they were too far away at the top of the stairs for my lapel mic to pick up their voices. I did an incredibly awkward thing and just began gently climbing the stairs towards them. Finally, I was able to see her. Valentina. She was petite, dressed nicely, her short hair a light brown color, beautifully coiffed. She held out a hand to stop me.
I'm sorry. Well, I'll be here. We're doing an 8-episode audio series about a man named Vitaly Yurchenko who came and then redefected back to the Soviet Union in 1985.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's like history. Something historical? You know,
Yes, yeah.
Where she's from?
No, it's from someone she knew.
From someone you knew. And they wanted to interview you. Are you interested? No? Yeah, she's
I don't need your question, and I don't need.
Should I? Okay.
I don't understand.
Yeah. It's okay.
Okay.
It's fine.
Okay. We can come back with a translator or something next time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. You good? You good? Thank you.
Oh, did you hear that? She said, as we were leaving, she said, listen, to her neighbor, she said, sometimes it's not the first time. Like, as in, we're not the first people to come to her. We walked back to the car, stunned. When I said Vitaly Yurchenko, nothing, no reaction. Nothing. It was amazing. Well, I gotta say, I'm shocked that she was there.
Yeah.
I really thought this would be a swing and a miss.
Yeah.
Especially when we saw the stairs.
Yeah.
She's in great shape, but she's a petite woman, right? Like, she's.
She looked really good.
She looked great. Like brown hair, physically like very able. I will say, she looks early 80s. She looks like late 70s, early 80s. I wonder whether she wasn't a few years younger than her husband, or than either of them. She pretended not to understand anything we were saying. I do think that was pretend. Yeah, she doesn't need basically she doesn't need our question. She doesn't want us there, was my understanding of that. Yeah. When we told her like what we were there for, she did not look confused when we explained that part. She was listening very carefully, but with a totally straight face. And then she pretended as though this meant nothing to her. But as we were walking away, I heard her say, "This is not the first time," to her neighbor who let us in, which means to me that that's Valentina, or that it's a woman who multiple people have thought is Valentina. Listen, I'm not holding my breath for her to take part in this, but I am. There was something like, I felt I got like a jolt to see her there and to hear her there and to realize that she's here is very exciting. Also, not for nothing, hilarious that we just experienced a very similar thing as Vitaly Yurchenko. We're like, hey, we were just no? Okay, cool.
Does that make me the guard in the back?
Yeah, that makes you the Canadian Secret Service agent.
I'm so flattered I'm wearing red today.
Oh my God. I gotta say, a little bit of heartbreak, man, Vitaly. I feel a shade of what you must have felt.
Yeah, she's pretty blunt with us. Can you imagine?
I don't need you. Goodbye. While I may have experienced a similar cold shoulder as Yurchenko, the difference was that it didn't ruin my life. Yurchenko, on the other hand, appeared dejected. If he was acting, he was convincingly portraying a man sliding into a deep depression. Here's Colin.
He was not happy. Rest assured, he was not happy.
And Dan, his guard, recalls the slump too.
When he came back, the day he got back from Canada, I was at the Safehouse. I said, Alex, I'm really sorry things didn't work out for you. And this was like the first time he ever opened up about, to me anyway, about his personal life. And he said it was something I never expected. I never would have imagined in a million years that she would not come with me. And he was devastated by that. It was not too long after that, like I would say within days, he actually started going back on things that he had told us in the debriefings. Again, he was going to be coming back with the love of his life, right? And then it all collapsed. And I mean, we talked between us, and it was like, every guy has been dumped at some point in their life, but nobody has been dumped and the president knew about it. Everybody knew, the president knew.
Mike Rochford agrees.
He has affections for her, whatever she told him, he believed. And so he thought he's walking into his future when he knocks on the door, right? He goes up to Canada. And when he comes back, he's acting like a high school kid who had just got dumped on a date, right? So Reed and I spend the evening with him out by the lake in the Safehouse at Coventry, and he's like talking about his future and whether or not he's got, a future here or whatever.
Mike knew the Valentina news had hit him hard, but he attributes Yurchenko's blues more to the leaks.
So the leaks were huge. I mean, the Valentina thing, I don't know. I think he would have gotten over that, but I think they made too much of a big deal out of that. I mean, come on. What guy hasn't been told no by a woman? I'm sorry.
Here's Milt Bearden, the deputy chief of the SE division.
All right, so what happened, everything happened within 24 hours to him. There he is, and it was in the Washington Times, right? Casey's paper. And then Valentina says, well, I love my hero, but not my traitor. Get out of here. And wow. Then you have that human reaction like, holy shit, I've made a monstrous mistake. And then he comes back and sees that he's a national figure by name. All of it. Valentina, the Washington Times, and he's not going to die like his mother.
When he got back from Canada, Yurchenko slept most of the day. His appetite faded away. Then, according to Paul Redmond, Yurchenko received the most definitive news yet that his supposed cancer really wasn't cancer.
We took him to Johns Hopkins in a big way, and he was not dying of cancer.
That he was fine and would live a long life. Not only did Valentina reject him, and not only are the lives of his family ruined because of the leak and his life choices, but he'd now have a very long and lonely life to contemplate that. The psychologist from the defector resettlement staff wrote a memo that Yurchenko might be a suicide risk. Here's John Fitzpatrick, one of his other bodyguards.
The attention quickly shifted in the guidance to us to be on the lookout and for, his mood, and of course he would show up in the paper every couple of days. Something about him would be in the newspaper.
The CIA would need to come up with some way to lift his spirits, and fast. Colin Thompson had an idea.
Well, at that point, I said maybe we should take a trip. Get out of the debriefings and so forth. And so, and he'd been here a couple of months at that time, and he'd been working pretty hard, so did I. And so we decided, well, and I wish I'd taken him someplace else, but it didn't matter where we went, really. I said, well, let's go to Arizona and Grand Canyon, Las Vegas, the parks, the national parks, because he seemed to appreciate the wide open spaces a bit.
A road trip through the American Southwest with a great pit stop in Las Vegas, where maybe they could remind Vitaly that there were other fish in the sea. Just your regular old boys' trip to Vegas. More on that next time on The Redefector. The Redefector is a production of Waveland. I'm Julie Cohn, and I wrote and created the series. Jason Hoke is the executive producer, and he also produced and edited the series. Shane Freeman is our sound engineer. Additional production assistance provided by Leo Culp. Music by Robert Ellis. If you love the series, please make sure to leave a review and to tell a friend. Follow Waveland on Instagram at @Waveland Media for more information on this series and more. Thanks for listening.